You know what? I think it's time. I feel like now Max Verstappen has truly and utterly decided to take things seriously, tug at his racing overalls, and mutter the famous words, engage. Yes, I know it was said in the words of Jean-Luc Picard, but I couldn't really put on a Dutch accent for that. I tried and it failed, and I didn't want to embarrass myself. But my point is that Max is going full tilt, so it's good for all of us. Now, even though Max Verstappen has previously said that he would rather win a race comfortably, with that quote being spread about the internet to show that he cannot handle the pressure of a title battle anymore, the rest of that quote, which some people forget to mention, and sometimes I've forgotten to mention in the past as well, should the teams get a lot closer to him, Max gets pleasure from that as well, because that's when he gets to go racing. A common sticking point for him when situations arise that limit his enjoyment of racing or even the ability to go racing. I still attest that if Max Verstappen had access to a time machine, he would transport himself all the way back to the 1960s, blag a seat at Lotus alongside Jim Clark, him being his teammate, and basically going around the Nürburgring at full pelt without really much regard for safety, just for the fact that he can go and race a car which has no reliance on aerodynamics, and basically he can just absolutely have a blast. And it's my personal belief that the seminal F1 movie Grand Prix from 1966 is one of Max's favourite movies, because it's all about Formula 1, and I do recommend it before you go and see the Brad Pitt movie next year, and I should warn you, it's quite blunt when it comes to all of the perils of motor racing. Just like how Max is pretty blunt when it comes to the new competition. When he was being interviewed during the Goodwood Festival of Speed, Verstappen though was for sure excited in regards to more competition. Here's what he said in full, and don't worry, I'm not going to inflict a Dutch accent on you, instead a posh faux British accent. Ahem. We had some great years. Of course, this year also started off really competitively, and now everyone's catching up a bit. Every race is a proper battle as well, so it's great. I think that theme will continue also for the rest of the season, so it's really unknown what is going to happen, and that's great for the sport. I mean, in general, it's just great to have so many fantastic drivers in F1 and making it difficult to win. I think everyone was waiting for that as well, and that's definitely what F fans want. To have this is great between so many different teams as well. It's going to be a great rest of the year. You see, that is actually a pretty good quote, because even though Max Verstappen has been dominant, he is aware of that fact and he hopes that it can actually change for the better, and this year could do just that. Granted, he's probably a little bit more chilled about things at the moment, considering he has an 80-plus point lead in the championship at half-time, and not to mention for the fact that Red Bull's closest rivals are taking turns as to who is actually leading the Constructors' Challenge, and it's like Mercedes and McLaren are going, no, after you, good sir. No, after you, good sir. No, I insist, go first, you fool. In all seriousness though, there is currently no one team firmly placed to actually mount a solid and consistent challenge toward Red Bull for the Constructors. You really get the sense that in the last few races, when Red Bull haven't exactly been the fastest team out there, that Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes could easily clinch that top spot, but there's been something that sort of prevented them. McLaren and Mercedes are headed in the right direction, with the former needing to work on their strategy and for Norris to galvanise his resolve against Verstappen, whilst the latter, Mercedes, just needs that little bit extra from the W15 to be right up at the front regularly. Although at the same time, I do reckon that given the current weather predictions for the Hungaroring on Sunday, it's going to be a scorcher, like 33 degrees, and as we all know, that Mercedes car does not do all that well in hot weather, so that actually might derail the potential comeback of Mercedes. So people thinking that Lewis Hamilton might get back-to-back wins, well, I hope that one of the upgrades that they're planning to bring to Hungary Mercedes is something to do with the cooling, because, El Scorchio. Otherwise, they might be struggling, whereas Ferrari are just struggling in general, so I'll leave it at that, because it's just too painful to elaborate. Nevertheless, the last couple of years have been relatively stress-free for Max, and he knows it. He's realistic about how the good times aren't going to last forever. You can tell that Verstappen is starting to sit up and take notice, whilst also not being too stressed out in regards to that competition and what Red Bull can achieve. Well, he certainly knows what he can do in his own belief and ability, so that's always a good plus. Max has no ambitions left to achieve in Formula 1. He's basically done everything at this point. When you step back and think about it, sure, 3 world titles. It doesn't sound that amazing. Other drivers have done it. But when you step back even further, you have to understand that Max Verstappen is only one of 5 drivers in the entire sport, in the entirety of Formula 1's history, that has managed to win 3 drivers' titles in a row or more. In terms of podiums, wins and poles, he's racing up the ranks as well, and I still attest that the only record he probably wants to get now is the one regarding Grand Slams, which is currently held by Jim Clark. Max does need 4 more to do so, by the way, but he's already up there with the likes of Michael Schumacher and Alberto Ascari, so he's not exactly slumming it. When you take that into account, as well as his Red Bull contract ending in 2028, Max has effectively 4 more years left to enjoy Formula One, or at least hopefully he can still enjoy it, because the 2026 regulations he is not a fan of. He wouldn't have written them if he had the power, as he's actually said, and that could actually lead to him leaving Formula One earlier than predicted, but hey, whatever he does right now, it doesn't matter. It's all good. He can just ride along with how he feels about Formula One, and anything he achieves next is a bonus. That is a huge luxury to have. Not many Formula One drivers get that luxury in being able to decide exactly what they want to do. But just because Max Verstappen doesn't really have to worry about getting any more titles, because he simply doesn't care about any more titles, that doesn't mean he won't stop testing the boundaries. And what made me sit up and take notice is what went on in Imola not long after the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix. All of this in regards to the RB18 being wheeled out of its retirement home and pounded around Imola for some testing, with Max in the car no less. Usually, this kind of job is allocated to either Liam Lawson or another Red Bull Jr. who's fortuitous to get a run in a championship-winning car. If this had been Liam or a Red Bull Jr., I wouldn't really have batted an eyelid. I wouldn't have just seen this as anything major. I mean, think about it. McLaren wheeled out Mick Schumacher recently for a Pirelli tyre test at Silverstone, so it's not exactly groundbreaking. If Max viewed this as pointless, this exercise, he would have refused to get in the car and the team wouldn't have been able to do much about it, but he didn't do that and went along with the plan. Since, well, he just raced there not that long ago. And it goes along with the notion that he had mentioned earlier this year that the fundamental issue the ground effect RBs had with riding curbs has been around since the RB18. Yet fortunately, because the RB18 and the RB19 were so good in other areas of development, it didn't really matter as much. They could focus on other things, which explains why, last year, Red Bull weren't so good around Singapore, because you had to rely a lot on curbs. And it was a good thing they added that extra straight, because I think Red Bull would have been even further off the pace. I really hope they keep that back straight for this year, because it's just so good. We don't need that bit under the Marina grandstand. We don't need that. This level of focus is a major indicator that both Max and Red Bull are really taking the matter of their rivals more seriously than ever before. They've been given a stay of execution, but at the same time they have the luxury of being able to relax just that little bit more than they would have otherwise had this been 2025, because I believe that next year it's going to be game on throughout the entire season. The first few races, up until I think the Chinese Grand Prix, Red Bull had the luxury of being the fastest car by a convincing margin. They were able to build a big enough gap for Max, that means he doesn't have to worry too much about the title just yet, especially in the first half, and Red Bull had a good enough gap because Checo was performing quite impressively. But then that completely fell off, and now Red Bull are starting to sweat buckets. It's sort of like what happened with Brawn GP, how they romped off in the first third of 2009, which gave themselves and Jenson Button a big enough cushion for Red Bull and Vettel to basically go hand over fist in trying to clinch both titles, but they couldn't quite do it. They threw everything trying to get at the pre-Mercedes team, and they couldn't quite do it. I personally don't see anything wrong with the RB18 being wheeled out and Max choosing to go into that car, because, well, it's a fair enough comparison. But naturally, it's going to get all the other teams crying foul. But then at the same time, you do get Red Bull crying foul at other teams when they're producing things. What about the flexi front wing debate? That came back around again because Red Bull complained about it. Teams complain about other things, but you know when the leading team are complaining about all the other teams that they're feeling a little bit stressed out, so, okay, alright. This time, it's Fred Vasseur over at Ferrari, them reckoning that the test was all about development rather than the reference one that Red Bull engineers had claimed, to try and give some maximum comparisons to the RB20. I mean, that could be possible, but it would be incredibly hard to police because, well, you know, they're perfectly in the rules to do that. So long as the car is more than 2 years old, then you can run it. There's nothing stopping Ferrari running the SF75 to try and gain some comparisons to the porpoising issue that they're currently having when it comes to long straights and whatnot, when they're seeking high downforce. They can easily do that, and I bet you that they will do that more with the SF23 when they can do that next year, because that was a car that did sort out the porpoising issue. So Ferrari, they're more than welcome to do anything to try and sort out that issue. It's not just Red Bull doing it randomly. And I apologise in advance for what I'm about to say next, but we are going to be talking about Austria in this next segment. Now, don't worry, I'm not talking about who was to blame. I'm talking more about what Max Verstappen learnt from that weekend. The aftermath and how the conduct after any of these incidents could hinder or aid Verstappen's title charges either this year or next. Because I don't think you need me to tell you that right now, F1 cars are bulletproof. They've been the most reliable than they have been in the entire history of Formula One. The amount of races that I've seen no single mechanical DNFs, or even any DNFs for that matter, are becoming all the more frequent. I remember many races where you get a single figure amount of cars crossing the finishing line. I mean, we don't need to talk about Monaco 1996, where only 3 cars finished the actual race, but that was common. It was fairly common for drivers to lose out on championship campaigns due to poor reliability, or that singular failure being the thing that made all the difference. I only have to point you to the 2016 Malaysian Grand Prix as a recent example. Lewis Hamilton was leading that race, but then he didn't. At lap 41, he had an engine failure, and that cost him many points. Rosberg ended up on the podium, and then Lewis lost the championship by 5 points. Had he won that race, had that engine not conked out, he would have won it, and we would have had a situation where Lewis Hamilton would have gone on to win the World Championship 7 times in a row. And that, again, is just one example. It really does go to show you that DNFs and collisions, they matter more than ever. Undoubtedly, in Spielberg, points were thrown away in the case of both Norris and Verstappen. Fortunately for Max, the damage to his car was less than Lando's damage, and it did result in him actually extending his lead in the championship more than it would have done had the two kept it clean, and Lando not got past. Now, do I reckon that this is a sign that Max Verstappen has suddenly become immature, that he's now Crashtappen again, like the British media tend to portray? Well, I personally don't think that. I think this was just simply a learning exercise for both drivers. Max was thinking that Lando would do one thing, and then he got it wrong. He assumed one thing, but then another thing happened, which resulted in both cars sustaining damage. And I know, in retrospect, my initial video, my raw reaction to it, I did get quite heated, and I was blaming people unnecessarily, and once again, I do apologise for that. This consideration could be something that either makes it easier or harder for Max going into the second half of the year. But it's my personal belief that he's already learned his lesson what will happen with Lando, and he's looking to rectify it, and learn from it. Because if the logic that Max hadn't changed were to apply in Silverstone, then when Lando sailed past into Stowe, Max would not have let Lando pass, even though the McLaren at the time was faster than the Red Bull, and they would have crashed again. Well, that didn't happen. It's all about when to pick your battles and when not to go looking for trouble. Right now, Max is figuring that, okay, this year, Lando is my greatest challenger. He is the one second place in the championship. I should really start to figure out what he's like when he's got a car that is equal to or better than mine. And he realised that at that point, McLaren was simply too good, let him past, because, oh, would you look at that? That level of logic and patience resulted in him getting in second place in the Grand Prix anyway, because McLaren snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, what with their strategy calls, and Mercedes had a reliability issue with George, and then, simply showed that, the old Max rival of Lewis, he still had it in some ways in these changeable conditions. So when we go back to the Goodwood quote in that part where he mentions about there being fantastic drivers which make it difficult to win, he is not wrong. There are really good drivers amongst the field, but due to the sheer domination of the latter RB18 and the RB19, they sort of been brushed aside, many people not being able to figure when you compare Max Verstappen and even Checo on his day when he was able to get a 1-2 or at least a 1-3. The crop in 2023 especially was somewhat muted, unable to really maximise the full potential of their ability because, put simply, Red Bull would completely cream them, save for maybe an early Aston Martin surge which peaked in Monaco, or the occasional sprint challenger, namely, of course, my boy. Now though, Max is getting either acquainted or reacquainted with who's able to get the most out of their cars, and this is something he is aware of, since he's keen to not let Red Bull rest on their laurels or just shrug their shoulders and say that the team has nothing left to find in terms of performance. Yes, we all know the quotes that Christian Horner has been bandying about all over the media, whoever will listen, that, oh, convergence is a real thing and that Red Bull has reached the peak and we are now seeing diminishing returns, so we've got to be realistic that performance and updates might be rarer to find, and then, of course, there's the revelation that actually broke while I've been recording this, that potentially Red Bull ignored some of Adrian Newey's feedback regarding the RB20, so maybe this was a rod for their own back. But either way, Max Verstappen is quite keen to keep people motivated. You think he's a hard nut and that he's not really caring about what Red Bull are doing and what the people at the factory are doing? No, he definitely does care. Max Verstappen is not a bad guy. He's a ruthless and honest guy, though, and I'm even further emboldened by this vibe that Max is still a good guy, in that during the Goodwood Festival of Speed, when all the Red Bull drivers were on the balcony, he made sure that Honda was able to see all of the crowd take in this adulation from all of the Red Bull fans and Formula One fans, because this was her day to be part of the Red Bull experience, and that was really gent-like performance. Max is a good guy. He's not a demon. And then when you hear Helmut Marko go, thank God, in terms of having upgrades ready for the Hungaroring after their other upgrades in recent races have only staved off the chases instead of kicking on, you know things are headed more and more towards squeaky bum time in the Red Bull factory. Do I think that Max Verstappen is going to lose the 2024 title right now at the halfway point of the season? I don't really think so, because even if Lando, Lewis, George, Carlos, Charles, or hopefully even Oscar, start to bag wins away from Max, so long as Max is still up there on the podium or in the top 5, then he's good. I still find it really amazing that some stats point out that maybe last year, if Max Verstappen called it quits before the summer break and decided to not show up when they all resumed in late August, he would have still won the title by a singular point. That's crazy. Not even Michael Schumacher could do that. Max will test the waters as to who's competitive and who isn't, and who can be the real challengers for next year. Again, the luxury that he had at the beginning of the season allows him to be really analytical as to who can be a genuine opponent, and I think he's actually starting to get more and more excited, whilst also not being too stressed, and that means we could get peak Verstappen. If you think I'm a Verstappen fanboy or a Lewis fanboy, you're wrong. I'm not. I respect both men and their achievements, and what I really want to see, and as Max has said in his quotes, that he wants F1 fans to enjoy it and get something out of it. No longer have a boring period where things are just getting stale. He admits that, and we won't be seeing that for the next 18 months. It's going to be great until the rules completely change that, and we might get something even better, or we might not, and it might be boring or completely ridiculous because everyone's complaining about it. But okay, hear me out. We are going to see Max pushing the envelope and sizing up potential rivals. We'll begin to see how his rivalry with Lando Norris develops once the British driver toughens up a little more, and whether or not it can lead to a season-long effort for the title from him and his team. We might even get a chance to see maybe more clashes and contesting for victory with Lewis Hamilton, his old rival from 2021. And I feel like if that were to happen again, and Lewis did end up being the main rival to Max Verstappen for 2025, it would be a far cleaner affair. Both men would have learnt from the experiences of 2021 and would be keen for not to get as ruthless as it was again, because with that revelation of Max Verstappen got blurry vision for many races afterwards, and he still has issues with his eyesight to this day. That's hardcore, and it really hammers home how bitter that rivalry got, that Max was not willing to tell medical staff about his issues and he just fobbed it off and he carried on through it anyway. I'm pretty sure that he and Lewis would not want to get to that same escalated vibe again. You can tell that time has healed things between them, although Lewis wasn't overly blaming Max initially for what happened and more the system. But the press conferences where Lewis wasn't going to get embroiled in what happened with Lando and Max in Austria is a good sign that a potential title fight between the multiple champions in 2025 would be better, but also just as exciting. There's also George Russell to consider, because Mercedes are right on the uptick, they're looking good, and if George is able to lead the team without any rumblings from Lewis and vice versa, then we might see Russell actually becoming the driver that we all hoped he would have been circa 2022. Then there's Ferrari and how they can turn things around after making their own drivable car undrivable, and how Charles Leclerc can bounce back from this, him being one of the most adept at cracking the nut that is Max Verstappen due to their years of karting together. Could we maybe even see best buddies Fernando and Max duking it out for a couple of Grand Prix next year? Well, I think that might be a bridge too far, considering how Aston Martin have fallen off, and they're really looking to 2026 in hopes to try and get themselves up the order, because next year is probably just going to be trying to fend off any potential rivals in Haas or Racing Bulls, because seriously, Haas, Nico, this year it's been amazing. But trust me, 2025 is going to be a banger, so do be sure to subscribe to this channel, because I'll be covering that season throughout, as well as how things go this year. Then of course there's Oscar Piastri to consider, and even though I have some bias toward the Aussie, I reckon he could one day be the most intense rival for Max, once he has the car and team behind him, being the Prost to Max's Senna-like ruthlessness. Something I explore more of in this video here, that you can go and watch right now. And even though it may seem balmy due to Oscar being so young, well, Max was young at one point and he won world titles.